The afternoon sun painted Eagle Ridge Valley in colors that belonged to memory more than sight. Gold and amber spilled across the ridge lines while shadows pooled in the draws like dark water. James Thornton sat in his rocking chair on the porch, 75 years pressing down on shoulders that had carried more than their share of burden. His walking stick leaned against the rail, its wood worn smooth by decades of use. The same hands that gripped it now had once been quick with a rifle, steady with a rope, gentle with wounds that needed tending. Now those hands showed every year of their age, knuckles swollen with arthritis, skin thin as parchment, stretched over bone. Henry stood at the porch railing, 15 years old, tall for his age, with the kind of restless energy that came from being young and uncertain and full of questions he didn't quite know how to ask. The boy had been working up his courage all afternoon, stealing glances at his grandfather, trying to find the right words for questions that felt dangerous somehow. Finally, he spoke. The words came out rushed, like he had to say them fast before courage failed him. "Grandpa, people in town, they say grandmother was Apache. They say it like it's something shameful. Is it true?" James let the question hang in the air between them. He looked past his grandson toward the small cemetery plot beyond the barn, where fresh wildflowers marked a grave 3 years old. Even now, even after all this time, her name carried weight in his chest. Ayita. He had placed those flowers there this morning, same as he did every morning, would keep doing it until his own bones went into the ground beside hers. "Yes, boy," James said finally, his voice carrying the rough texture of old leather left too long in the sun. "That's true." Henry turned from the railing, his young face struggling between curiosity and something that looked uncomfortably like shame. The borrowed shame that came from other people's judgments, ill-fitting as someone else's coat. How did you?" The boy fumbled for words that wouldn't sound like accusation. James held up one weathered hand, stopping the awkward attempt at a diplomacy. "Sit down, Henry, I'll tell you the story proper. Not the version folks whisper at church socials when they think I can't hear. The real one. The true one." The boy sat quickly, eager now that permission had been granted. James let silence settle between them first. Silence mattered. It gave weight to what came next, made the words land with proper force. "Everything I have today," James began, his gaze distant, looking at things 15-year-old boys couldn't see. "This ranch, the Thornton name, even my life itself, all of it started with 5 words from a woman holding a knife." He paused, watching the last light catch the edges of the valley where shadows were already claiming the low places. "Summer of 1878, I was 38 years old, younger than your father is now, but old enough to know better. And I was dying, Henry. Not from disease or bullet, mind you. Dying from the inside out, the way a man does when he's got nothing left worth waking up for." The old man's fingers traced patterns on his walking stick, following grooves worn by time and touch. "Your great-grandmother Margaret had been gone 3 years by then. Took our baby daughter with her when she went. This ranch was just dirt and timber and loneliness. I kept working because stopping would mean admitting the truth, that I was already dead, just too stubborn to fall down." James tapped his stick twice against the porch boards, a decisive sound that marked the turning point in his story. Then one afternoon in July, everything changed. Started with gunfire in a creek bed and ended with me learning that strength isn't about never breaking down. It's about what you do after the breaking, when you got nothing left but a choice between giving up and standing back up. He closed his eyes, and the years fell away like autumn leaves. "Let me take you back, Henry. Back to the day I learned what family really means." Eagle Ridge Valley, July 1878. Heat came down on the valley like divine judgment. High noon meant white light that bleached the color out of everything, reducing the world to harsh contrasts between burning brightness and deep shadow, the kind of heat that made even breathing feel like work. James Thornton rode his bay gelding along the eastern boundary of Ironwood Ranch. The horse was named Flint, 6 years old, steady as bedrock, and twice as reliable as most men James had known. He trusted the animal's instincts more than his own these days, and when Flint's ears suddenly swiveled forward, body tensing beneath the saddle, James knew something was wrong before his own dulled senses caught up. Then sound reached him. A cry, sharp and desperate, echoing up from the dry creek bed below where Black Creek used to run before the summer drought reduced it to nothing but smooth stones and dust. James pulled Flint to a halt and studied the ravine. The cottonwood trees that lined the former creek still provided cover, their thick trunks casting pools of shadow deep enough to hide things that preferred to stay hidden. Movement caught his eye. 3 figures on horseback, circling something, and 2 more figures on foot, backed against jumbled rocks with nowhere left to run. A woman and a child. James didn't waste time thinking. Thinking was for men who still believed their lives mattered, who had something precious to lose. He pulled his Winchester Model 1873 from its saddle scabbard. The rifle held 15 rounds of .44 caliber authority, and James knew its weight and balance the way a man knows his own heartbeat after years of keeping company. He raised the rifle and fired a single shot. The bullet struck rock 10 feet ahead of the circling riders, exactly where James intended it to land. The sharp crack echoed across the valley like thunder announcing a storm. The lead rider's horse reared. All 3 men spun in their saddles, searching for the source of the shot. James sat his horse in plain sight on the ridge above, rifle steady, silhouetted against the white sky. A clear target if they wanted him, or a clear warning if they had sense. "That's close enough," James called down. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had already made peace with whatever came next, who had nothing left to fear because everything worth protecting had already been taken from him. "Next one finds flesh instead of stone." The 3 riders exchanged glances. They weren't law, that much was obvious from their trail-worn clothes and the nervous way they sat their horses. Hired guns maybe, or opportunists following the scent of easy prey. Either way, they understood the mathematics of their situation. 1 rifleman on high ground with clear shooting lanes versus 3 men trapped in an open creek bed with no cover. Bad odds. The lead rider spat tobacco juice into the dust and jerked his horse's head around. The other 2 followed without protest. Within seconds they were gone, their horses kicking up dust plumes that hung in the still air like smoke signals announcing retreat. James waited. Patience had kept him alive through 38 years of hard country living. He held his position until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, until the dust settled, until he was certain this wasn't some kind of trick to draw him down into a trap. Only then did he urge Flint down the rocky slope into the creek bed. He kept the Winchester ready, not pointing directly at the woman and child, but not putting it away either. Trust was earned through time and testing, never given freely. The valley bred that kind of caution into anyone who survived long enough to learn its lessons. As he drew closer, the woman stepped forward. She moved like someone trained to fight, balanced on the balls of her feet, weight centered and ready to shift in any direction. A knife gleamed in her right hand, held low and professional, the way someone holds a blade when they actually know how to use it. Her clothes were Apache style, buckskin and woven cloth, both dusty from hard travel. Her hair fell past her shoulders in dark waves, tangled with bits of sage and dried grass. But it was her eyes that stopped James cold. Dark and fierce, and full of the kind of sharp intelligence that calculated angles and measured threats before most people even knew danger was present. She looked at him the way a person looks at a horse before buying it, checking for soundness, searching for signs of meanness or weakness, reading him like a book written in scars and silence. Behind her, pressed against her back as if trying to disappear into her shadow, stood a boy of perhaps 10 years old. The child's eyes were enormous in his thin face, but he made no sound. Didn't cry out or cling to his mother, the way frightened children usually did. His silence had a quality to it that felt wrong somehow. Not peaceful, but enforced, as if speech itself had been beaten out of him by something too terrible to give voice to. James lowered his rifle slightly, a gesture meant to communicate peace. He stayed mounted, giving the woman space to decide whether he represented salvation or just a different flavor of danger. "You hurt?" he asked. The woman didn't answer immediately. She studied him for another long moment, her gaze moving methodically from his face to his rifle, to his horse, to the brand on his saddlebag. Reading every detail, building a picture of who and what he was. Then she spoke. Her English was rough, each word carefully selected and shaped with visible effort. "You need a woman like me." James blinked, startled by the sheer directness of it. No tears, no pleading, no gratitude for being saved. Just a statement of fact delivered with the bluntness of a business proposition. "Ma'am," he managed. "I can work," she continued, her accent thick but her meaning crystal clear. "Cook, fix things, care for animals. I just need shelter." The boy shifted behind her, and for the first time James saw that he clutched a leather pouch against his chest with both small hands. The child's knuckles were white from the intensity of his grip, as if letting go of that pouch would mean letting go of life itself. James looked from the woman to the silent boy and back again. Every instinct told him to point them toward Redstone Town and let the law or the church handle whatever trouble they were running from. A rancher living alone on the edge of civilization had no business taking in strangers, especially not Apache strangers, in territory still raw from decades of bloodshed and broken treaties. But something in the woman's stance, in the way she held herself, despite obvious exhaustion and pain, reminded him of Margaret. Not in appearance. They looked nothing alike. But in the quality of pride that refused to beg even when begging might save her life. And the boy, that terrible silence. James recognized it. It was the same silence that had filled Ironwood Ranch for 3 years. The kind that grew like weeds when words stopped having any purpose or power. James made his decision without fully understanding why. Maybe because he was tired of his own silence. Maybe because saving someone else felt like a chance at redemption for the ones he'd failed to save. Maybe just because turning away felt like becoming something he didn't want to be. "Get on the horse," he said, dismounting in one smooth motion. "Both of you." The woman hesitated. Suspicion and hope warred visibly across her face, neither one winning. "I got a ranch 5 miles north," James continued, keeping his voice level and calm. "Ironwood, not much to speak of, but it's shelter. You can work if you want to earn your keep. But first we need to get out of this creek bed before those men change their minds about the quality of their courage." The woman looked at the boy. Some silent communication passed between them, something deeper than words could carry. Then she nodded once, sharp and decisive. James helped them onto Flint's back, the woman and child both, while he took the reins and led the horse on foot. They moved slowly. James set a walking pace that wouldn't tire the heavily burdened gelding on the long trek back to the ranch. As they climbed out of the creek bed, James noticed the woman favoring her left side, a wound hidden beneath her buckskin shirt. Not bleeding fresh, but not fully healed either. She'd been running hard and long. That much was clear from the set of her shoulders and the careful way she moved. The boy kept one hand on that mysterious leather pouch, never letting it go, never making a sound. James's mind worked as they walked, questions piling up like cordwood, waiting to be split. But he kept those questions to himself for now. Questions could wait. First came safety, then came shelter, then came the careful work of building enough trust for truth to flow. That was the order of things in land that killed careless people. The walk to Ironwood took the better part of 2 hours. James felt every step of it in his shoulder, where a week-old wound from a mountain lion encounter had started going bad. The infection made the flesh around it hot and swollen, sending threads of fire down his arm with each movement. He'd been ignoring it the way he ignored most things that didn't involve the immediate survival of his cattle. The woman noticed. She saw the way he rolled his shoulder, trying to ease the stiffness, saw the slight grimace he couldn't quite hide when the movement pulled wrong. Her eyes narrowed and James realized she was assessing him again, this time looking for weakness rather than threat. When Ironwood Ranch finally came into view, James felt an unexpected stab of something like embarrassment. The place looked exactly like what it was. A working ranch kept functional by a man who had stopped caring about anything beyond basic function. The main cabin measured 24 feet by 18, built from ponderosa pine logs that had weathered to the color of old bone. 2 windows faced the yard, one more faced the eastern rise where the sun came up each morning. The door hung straight on its hinges. The roof didn't leak. The chimney drew smoke cleanly. Beyond those basic requirements, James hadn't bothered with improvements in 3 years. The barn stood 50 yards to the north, larger than the cabin because horses and cattle mattered more than human comfort in ranching country. A corral stretched out from the barn, split rail fence enclosing a 1/4 acre of trampled dirt. 4 horses and 20 head of cattle represented the sum total of James's wealth, aside from the land itself. A chicken coop leaning slightly to one side, A root cellar dug into the hillside, and a garden plot gone mostly to weeds completed the picture of Ironwood Ranch. 640 acres of survival wrapped in loneliness. The woman slid down from the horse with easy grace despite her injury. The boy followed, still clutching that leather pouch, still silent as carved stone. James tied Flint to the hitching post and turned to find the woman studying the cabin with that same calculating expression she'd used on him earlier. She was counting windows, he realized, checking sight lines, measuring distances to the tree line. This was a woman who'd learned to think tactically, to see every place as a potential battlefield. "Come inside," James said. "Get out of the sun." The cabin's interior offered blessed coolness after the hammer heat of the afternoon. James had built the place himself years ago, working alongside Margaret and her brother. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all together. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold now in summer, but essential when winter came. A rough pine table, two chairs that didn't match, and a narrow bed completed the furnishings. Sparse, functional, empty of anything that suggested a life rather than just an existence. The woman stood in the doorway with one hand resting on the boy's shoulder. The child's eyes were enormous in his thin face, taking in everything with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that survival meant noticing details. James gestured toward the table. "You can sit if you want." The woman didn't sit. Instead, her gaze fixed on James's shoulder where his shirt had pulled tight across the inflamed wound. Without asking permission, she reached down and opened the leather pouch the boy carried so protectively. Inside was a collection of dried herbs, roots, and small stones wrapped in bits of cloth. The smell that rose from the pouch was complex, earthy, and medicinal, sharp with power. "I fixed this," she said, pointing at his shoulder. Not a question or an offer. A statement of what would happen next. James started to refuse automatically. The wound was nothing. He dealt with worse, but the woman was already moving, setting out her supplies on the table with the efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times before. "Sit," she said, pointing at one of the mismatched chairs. And because he was too tired to argue, because the wound hurt more than he wanted to admit even to himself, and because something in her competent movements suggested that maybe not everything had to be faced alone, James sat. The boy watched with solemn, unblinking eyes as his mother worked. She pulled out dried plants James didn't recognize, crushing them between her palms with practiced motions that spoke of deep knowledge passed down through generations. The smell that rose from her working hands was sharp and bitter, like sage mixed with something darker and more ancient. She poured a small amount of water into a wooden bowl and mixed the crushed herbs into a thick paste. The mixture turned a deep green color, almost black in the cabin's dim light. "This will hurt," she said, meeting James's eyes directly for the first time since entering the cabin. Her gaze held steady, honest in its warning. "But hurt means it works." She rolled up his sleeve without ceremony, exposing the wound. The flesh around it was angry red, hot to the touch, with yellow edges that spoke of infection taking deep hold. James had seen men lose whole arms to wounds that looked better than this one. He'd been a fool to ignore it, but ignoring pain had become his standard practice over the last 3 years. The woman's fingers were cool and steady as she cleaned the wound first with water from his rain barrel, then applied the herb paste with careful, deliberate movements. The pain came immediate and intense, like pressing bare skin against a hot stove. James sucked air through his teeth but didn't pull away. "Burns," he managed through clenched jaw. "Means it works," she replied with perfect calm. "Only men say just to scratch when blood does not stop." Behind her, the boy made a small sound. Not quite a word, but something close. His mother glanced at him and some communication passed between them in that look. Something James couldn't read but could feel the weight of. The boy whispered, barely audible even in the cabin's silence. "He's strong." The woman's expression softened just slightly, like ice beginning to thaw at the edges. Strong is not good if he is foolish. James found himself smiling despite the fire in his shoulder. When was the last time he'd smiled at anything? When was the last time anyone had called him foolish for trying to tough things out? Margaret used to say the same thing, chiding him for pushing too hard, for refusing to admit when he needed help or rest or simple human comfort. The memory brought pain sharper than the herbs burning in his wound. The woman wrapped the injury with strips of cloth torn from the hem of her own dress, tying the bandage with decisive knots that spoke of field medicine performed under conditions far worse than this comfortable cabin. When she finished, she stepped back, returning to her position by the door with the boy at her side. James flexed his shoulder experimentally. The pain had already begun to transform from sharp and hot to a deeper, more manageable ache that felt almost like healing. Whatever she'd put on the wound was working with a speed that seemed almost miraculous. "Thank you," James said. The words felt rusty in his mouth, unused for far too long. "I'm grateful." The woman nodded once. Then she said something that would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. "We work for shelter. You give, we give. This is not charity. This is trade." James studied her. She stood tall despite exhaustion that showed in every line of her body, despite the wound he could now see staining the side of her buckskin shirt dark with old blood, despite having run from something terrible enough to send hired guns after a woman and child through high desert country. She wasn't asking for handouts. She was proposing a contract, a partnership based on mutual need and fair exchange. "What's your name?" James asked. "Ayita." The word came out soft but clear, shaped by a language older than the borders men had drawn across this territory with treaties and wars. "I'm James, James Thornton, and this place is called Ironwood Ranch." He looked at the Bai, who still hadn't spoken. "And your son's name?" "Dakota," Ayita said. The pride in her voice was unmistakable and fierce. James waited a moment to see if the boy would speak his own name, confirm it in his own voice. When Dakota remained silent, James simply nodded once. He understood enough to know that some wounds ran deeper than flesh, that some damage took longer to heal than infected shoulders. The afternoon stretched long and quiet after that. James showed them where the well stood, how to work the pump that drew water up from 40 feet down. Showed them the outhouse, the chicken coop, the root cellar where food stayed cool even in the worst heat. Simple things that needed no complicated translation. Aida moved through the space with careful attention, learning the layout, understanding the resources available, mapping the territory in her mind the way scouts mapped enemy ground. When evening began painting the windows gold, James started a fire in the cast iron stove and pulled out what passed for his cooking supplies. Dried beef that was more leather than meat, potatoes from the root cellar, their eyes starting to sprout, carrots gone slightly soft but still edible, the makings of a simple stew that had sustained him through 3 years of solitary evenings that all blurred together into one long gray sameness. But before he could start cutting vegetables, Aida gently moved him aside. Her meaning was clear without words. This was her work now, part of the bargain they'd struck. James stepped back and let her take over the small kitchen space. While she worked, moving with quiet efficiency, Dakota wandered to the window. The boy pressed his face against the glass, staring out at the darkening valley. One hand still gripped that mysterious leather pouch like it was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid and uncertain. James found himself watching the child, wondering what horrors those young eyes had witnessed to steal his voice so completely. In the boy's silence, James heard echoes of his own 3 years of speaking to no one, answering to nothing, existing in a void where words had stopped having any meaning or purpose. The stew bubbled onto the stove, filling the cabin with smells that reminded James of better times, of evenings when Margaret would cook while he told her about his day, of plans made and futures imagined that never came to pass. Aida added things from her leather pouch to the cooking pot, herbs James couldn't name that transformed his plain survival food into something that actually smelled worth eating. When they finally sat down at the table, 3 people instead of the one that had become normal, Dakota suddenly dropped to the wooden floor. The boy pulled a piece of charcoal from somewhere in his clothing and began drawing directly on the floorboards with fierce, focused intensity. Aida saw what her son was drawing and her face went still and hard as stone. James leaned forward to look, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The drawing was crude the way a child's art is crude, but the meaning was brutally clear. A man lying on the ground. An unmistakable dark stain spreading from his chest. Blood. Other figures standing over the fallen man, and one figure larger than the others, holding something. A gun, maybe, or a knife. The boy drew with desperate concentration, his small hand moving rapidly, adding details as if getting them right mattered more than anything in the world. Aida spoke, her voice carrying the weight of stones piled on a grave. My husband, Thomas Whitefeather. This is how he died. James waited, giving her time and space to tell the story in her own way. This was grief too fresh and raw to be rushed. Thomas was scout for United States Cavalry for 10 years. Good scout. Fair man. He retired, wanted to make peaceful life for us. She gestured toward the terrible drawing taking shape on the floor. He found silver, small vein at Black Mesa, 2 miles from here. She paused, searching for the English words to carry the full burden of what came next. Not big silver, maybe $5,000 worth, but enough to buy land, build proper house for us. Thomas was happy. First time in years, he was truly happy. Her hands settled on Dakota's head, stroking his hair with gentle, automatic motions that spoke of comfort, given so many times it had become reflex. There was a man, Vincent Dutch. He owns Dutch Mining Company, big operation near Redstone Town. Rich man, powerful man. Aida's voice dropped lower, darker. His son Jacob was 12 years old. Last winter there was blizzard, bad storm. Jacob got lost in the snow. Thomas found him, brought him back to Dutch's house. James could already see where this story was heading, could feel the terrible logic of grief twisted into blame. But boy was already very sick when Thomas found him. Pneumonia in both lungs. Thomas tried everything, used all his medicine, all his prayers, all his knowledge. But Jacob died 2 weeks later. The boy's charcoal scratched against wood, adding more figures to his memorial in ash and memory. Dutch blamed Thomas, said Apache medicine killed his boy, said Thomas should have been able to save Jacob, that white doctors could have done better. Aida's voice went flat, emptied of everything except the bare need to finish the story. Thomas tried to explain that no medicine could save the boy, that disease was too far along, but Dutch would not hear. His grief made him deaf to reason. She pointed at the drawing. When Thomas found silver, Dutch wanted it, said it was fair payment for his son's life, said Thomas owed him that much. Thomas refused, said the silver was for our future, for Dakota's future. Not payment for grief, that was not his fault. Dakota's hand moved faster now, the charcoal creating shadows and suggesting violence with just a few desperate strokes. Dutch came to Black Mesa in May with 3 men. They found Thomas staking his claim. They fought. They died. Thomas would not give up the map showing where Silver Vein was, would not sell his rights. Aida's voice cracked just slightly. Dutch shot him, then they made it look like mining accident. Rockfall. They even carried rocks to cover the blood. She reached down and touched her son's shoulder, and the boy stopped drawing, his whole body trembling. Dakota followed his father that morning. He wanted to help, wanted to learn the mining. He was hiding behind rocks, watching. He saw everything. James felt something cold and terrible settle in his stomach. A 10-year-old boy forced to watch his father's murder, powerless to stop it, unable even to cry out for fear of being killed himself. No wonder the child had stopped speaking. What words could possibly be adequate to contain that kind of horror? When men left, Dakota came to me. Could not speak, but he drew picture like this. We went to find Thomas, found his body in the canyon exactly where Dakota showed me. Aida's hand trembled where it rested on her son's head. His eyes were still open, looking at sky. I closed them. We said prayers. Then we ran. She looked at James directly, her eyes holding nothing back. Dutch came to our home next day. Said I must give him the map or I would follow my husband. Said he would take Dakota, raise him white, make him forget his father. I told him I had no map. He did not believe me, so I took him to our fire, took out the only copy of Thomas's map, and burned it in front of him. Then we ran while he was still screaming with rage. The weight of the story pressed down on the cabin like physical force. James looked at the boy's drawing again, seeing it now not as crude art, but as testimony, as evidence, as the only voice a traumatized child had left to speak unspeakable truth. He chased us for 2 months, through Arizona territory, into New Mexico, back across the border. Today in the creek, that was his men. They almost caught us. Aida stood, preparing to gather her son, preparing to leave despite darkness falling outside, despite having nowhere to go. Dutch will not stop. He believes I still know where silver is, that I memorized the location before burning the map. He will come here, to your ranch. And then you will die too, just for helping us. She moved toward the door, pulling Dakota with her. James stood as well. He placed one hand flat on the table, fingers spread wide against wood scarred by 3 years of meals eaten alone. Not here, he said quietly but with absolute certainty. Not with me, not on my land. Aida turned back, studying him with those sharp, assessing eyes, weighing his words against 3 years of running, against a lifetime of broken promises from white men. You do not know Vincent Dutch, she said. He is not just one man. He has money, men, power. He has law on his side. Maybe so, James agreed. But I know this land. Every ridge, every draw, every place where a man could hide or make a stand. And I know something else. A man protects what's under his roof. That's not negotiable. That's not up for debate. You're under my roof now, both of you. That means something. Or it used to. Maybe it still should. The night pressed against the windows, full of all the threats and promises that darkness carries in wild country. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own hard decisions. But tonight, 3 people sat in a cabin that had been empty far too long, and something that felt almost like hope flickered, tentative and fragile in the space between them. Outside, coyotes began their evening song. The sound carried across the valley, lonely and defiant, and somehow beautiful in its persistence. James Thornton listened to their choruses and felt something shift in his chest, some ice beginning to crack after 3 years of frozen grief. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't singing alone anymore. And in the silence that followed the coyote's song, in the quiet of a cabin where 3 damaged people had found temporary shelter, the first seeds of something new began to take root. Not family yet, not trust, but the possibility of both, fragile as spring grass pushing up through hard-packed earth, the possibility of home. Morning came to Eagle Ridge Valley with a kind of light that made promises the land couldn't always keep. James woke before dawn, a habit carved into him by 38 years of ranching, and lay still for a moment in the darkness. Something was different. The cabin held sounds that didn't belong to solitude anymore. Soft breathing from the corner where Aida and Dakota slept on bedrolls James had pulled from the trunk, where Margaret's things still lay folded and waiting. He rose quietly, pulled on his boots, stepped out onto the porch into air that held the last coolness before the sun burned it away. The valley spread before him in shades of gray and purple, shadows still pooling in the low places while the ridgelines caught the first golden light. Behind him, the cabin door opened with a soft creak. Aida emerged, moving with the silence of someone trained to walk through dangerous country without advertising their presence. She stood beside him without speaking, looking east where the sun was preparing to announce itself. You pray in the morning, James said quietly. Statement, not question. He'd noticed the way she oriented herself, the way her lips moved soundlessly when she thought no one was watching. Yes, face the rising sun, Apache way, old way. She paused, then added, your wife. She prayed? Every morning, on her knees by the bed, Christian prayers. She tried to teach me, but I never had the patience for it. James felt the familiar ache in his chest, duller now after 3 years, but still present. Wish I'd tried harder. Wish I'd done a lot of things different. Aida turned her head to look at him, studying his profile in the growing light. Wishes changed nothing. Only work changes things. James nodded slowly. It was exactly the kind of practical wisdom Margaret would have appreciated. Reckon that's true enough. They stood in comfortable silence as the sun broke free of the horizon, spilling gold across the valley. James watched Aida's lips move in quiet prayer, words in a language he didn't understand but could respect. When she finished, she touched her fingers to her forehead, her heart, then spread her hands toward the sun in a gesture that looked like offering, or gratitude, or both. Coffee, coffee, James asked. I make it, Aida said, already moving toward the door. You teach me your stove yesterday. Today I practice. Inside, Dakota still slept, curled tight as a fist around that leather pouch. James looked at the mom and felt something twist in his chest. That kind of sleep wasn't restful. It was the sleep of exhaustion and trauma, the body shutting down because consciousness had become too heavy to bear. While Aida worked at the stove, learning the temperament of the cast iron that had its own particular demands, James sat at the table and thought about the hard truth they were all avoiding. Dutch wouldn't just give up. Men like that never did. They took what they wanted or destroyed what they couldn't have. And right now, what Dutch wanted was to finish what he'd started with Thomas Whitefeather, which meant Ironwood Ranch had just become a target. After breakfast, simple but filling, James made his decision. If Dutch was coming, and he surely was, then they needed to be ready. Not just ready to fight, but ready to survive a siege. "We need an escape route," James said, looking at Aida across the table. Dakota sat between them, listening with those solemn, ancient eyes. "A tunnel from the root cellar to the creek. 50 feet, maybe more. If they burn us out of the cabin, we need a way to get clear without being shot down in the open." Aida nodded slowly. "This is good thinking. Very good. Apache way is always have two paths, one for attacking, one for running. It'll take time, week, maybe 10 days if we work steady, and it'll be hard work. Digging's always hard, but digging in secret so nobody sees what we're doing, that'll be harder still." "We do it," Aida said simply. "All three of us, even Dakota. Strong hands make fast work." And so they began. The root cellar was dug into the hillside north of the cabin, a space 8 feet square and 6 feet deep, where James stored potatoes, carrots, turnips, anything that needed cool darkness to last through winter. The floor was hard-packed dirt and stone, the kind of ground that fought back against every shovelful. They started that same morning, taking turns in the confined space. James would dig for an hour until sweat soaked through his shirt and his shoulder. Still healing from Aida's treatment, began to throb with deep, warning pain. Then Aida would take over, attacking the earth with a fury that spoke of 3 years of running and fear turned into productive rage. Even Dakota helped, using a smaller spade to scoop loose dirt into buckets that he hauled up and out, spreading the evidence of their work across the garden plot where it would look like nothing more than ambitious planting preparation. They had to work quietly, sound carried in the valley, and they couldn't risk someone passing by and wondering what all the digging was about. So they worked in near silence, speaking only when necessary, communicating mostly through gestures and shared understanding. The tunnel had to be tall enough to crawl through but no taller, wide enough for a man's shoulders but no wider. Every cubic foot of earth removed was a cubic foot that had to be moved, hidden, explained away if questions came. They shored up the tunnel every 6 feet with timber beams salvaged from an old line shack that had collapsed the previous winter. The work was slow, backbreaking, and absolutely necessary. On the third day, while James was deep in the tunnel pushing the excavation forward, Aida called down to him. Her voice carried urgency without panic, which somehow made it more alarming. "James, come up, someone is here." James crawled backward through the tunnel they'd managed to dig so far, maybe 15 feet of progress. He emerged into the root cellar filthy with dirt, his hands raw from the shovel handle, and climbed up into the daylight to find Aida standing with her knife drawn and Sheriff Samuel Ridge sitting his horse in the yard. Ridge was a man in his late 50s, weathered by decades of keeping law in country that didn't much respect legal niceties. He wore his authority lightly but carried it with the confidence of someone who'd survived long enough to earn respect through competence rather than bluster. "Thornton," Ridge said, touching the brim of his hat. His eyes took in the knife in Aida's hand, the way she stood between him and the cabin, where Dakota surely watched from the window, the defensive posture that spoke volumes. "Heard you had visitors. Thought I'd ride out, see if everything was peaceful." James wiped dirt from his hands on his pants, aware that he looked exactly like a man who'd been digging something he didn't want discovered. "Everything's fine, Sam. These are my guests, Aida and her son Dakota. They're helping out around the place." Ridge studied Aida with eyes that missed nothing. "That's so. Funny thing, I got a telegram yesterday from Dutch Mining Company. Says they're looking for an Apache woman and a boy. Says she's wanted for questioning in connection with the death of Thomas Whitefeather. That name ring any bells?" James felt cold wash through him despite the heat of the day. Thomas was her husband, He was murdered by Vincent Dutch. She's running for her life, not from the law. Ridge sighed, a sound that carried more weariness than judgment. That may be true, James, probably is true, knowing Dutch's reputation. But law's the law, and I got official paperwork here says I'm supposed to bring her in for questioning. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket and held it up so they could see the seal of the territorial court. Now, I can tell you right now, I think this whole thing stinks like week old fish. Dutch has been throwing money around town, buying influence, getting documents drawn up real official-like. He's even got himself a witness, fellow named Jonah, who swears he saw the woman in white feather fighting right before Thomas turned up dead. That's a lie, Aida said, her English clear despite the accent. All lies. Dutch killed my husband. His man Jonah was there. He helped do it. Ridge nodded slowly. I believe you, ma'am. But believing you and being able to prove it in front of a circuit judge are two different things. Dutch has got himself what looks like a legal claim to the land where your husband found silver. Got documents showing Thomas sold him the rights before he died. Of course, the signature's a forgery, but it's a good one. Good enough to cause problems. James stepped forward. What are you saying, Sam? I'm saying Dutch is building a legal case to back up his illegal actions. Smart, in a snake-like way. Makes it harder to fight him because he's got law on his side, or what looks like law to folks who don't know better. Ridge folded the paper and put it back in his jacket. I'm also saying I'm going to lose this document somewhere between here and town. Probably blow right out of my saddlebag on the ride back. Damnedest thing. Relief flooded through James. I appreciate that, Sam. Don't appreciate it yet. This warrant I'm losing? There'll be another one coming. Circuit judge arrives in 2 weeks. When he does, I won't have any choice but to serve proper papers. You got 2 weeks to figure something out, find some proof that Dutch is lying, or get your guests somewhere safe. Ridge gathered his reins, preparing to leave. I'd suggest somewhere far away. California, maybe. Oregon. Somewhere Dutch's money and influence don't reach. We're not running, James said. Ridge looked at him for a long moment. Then you better be ready for what's coming. Dutch isn't just one man. He's got resources, hired guns, legal backing. You're one rancher with more courage than sense. 3 of us, James corrected. And this is my land. A man's got a right to defend what's his. That he does, Ridge agreed. But having the right to do something and having the ability to do it are different things. Think on that, James. Think hard. The sheriff rode away and James stood watching until he disappeared over the rise toward town. When he finally turned back, he found Aida studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You should have let him take me, she said quietly. You could have been done with this. Safe. Safety's overrated, James replied. And I already told you, you're under my roof. That means something, Em. It means you will die, Aida said. And there was something raw in her voice, some emotion she was fighting to keep contained. Like Thomas died. Like everyone who helps us dies. James walked closer until he was standing right in front of her. Then I'll die doing something that matters. That's more than I've had for 3 years. Dakota appeared in the doorway, his face pale. The boy walked straight to James and took his hand, small fingers wrapping around calloused palm. Then he took his mother's hand with his other, connecting the 3 of them in a chain of shared risk and growing trust. We don't have time to feel sorry for ourselves, James said, looking at both of them. We got 2 weeks, maybe less if Dutch gets impatient. We need to finish the tunnel, stockpile supplies, prepare for siege. And we need to teach this boy how to survive if things go wrong. Aida nodded, squaring her shoulders. Then we work. No more talking. Just work. And work they did. The tunnel grew by inches and then feet, pushing slowly toward the creek bed. They worked in shifts, round the clock when possible, taking turns sleeping and digging and standing watch. The physical labor was punishing, but it had a purpose that went beyond the simple act of moving earth. It was building something together, creating a path to survival through shared effort and determination. Between digging shifts, James began teaching Dakota the skills a boy needed to survive in hard country. They started with the basics, things that could mean the difference between life and death if everything went wrong and the boy found himself alone. First came shooting. James's Winchester Model 1873 weighed 9 pounds unloaded, a substantial piece of steel and walnut that had served him faithfully for years. It was too heavy for a 10-year-old boy under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances, and Dakota was stronger than he looked. They set up targets in the ravine behind the barn where the sound would be muffled by rock walls. James showed Dakota how to hold the rifle, how to press the stock tight into his shoulder so the recoil wouldn't knock him backward, how to sight down the barrel with both eyes open, how to breathe out halfway and hold it, squeezing the trigger with steady pressure instead of jerking it. The first shot knocked Dakota backward 2 steps despite James's warnings and instructions. The boy sat down hard in the dust, eyes wide with surprise. But he didn't cry, didn't complain, just stood back up, walked to the rifle where it had fallen, picked it up, and looked at James with determination written across his young face. Again, Dakota said. The word came out rough, unused, but it was a word. Another brick in the wall he was building back toward speech. They practiced for an hour each afternoon. By the third day, Dakota could stand his ground against the rifle's kick. By the 5th day, he could hit a 12-inch circle at 25 yards 1 time out of 3. By the 10th day, he was hitting it 2 times out of 3 and asking to try longer distances. James watched the boy's progress with something that felt dangerously like pride. Not pride in the skill itself, though that was impressive enough for a child. Pride in the determination, the refusal to quit, the way Dakota approached each challenge like it was a battle to be won through sheer force of will. In the evenings, after the day's work was done and supper had been eaten, Aida began teaching James about Apache ways. She did this without announcing it as teaching, just sharing knowledge the way water flows downhill, natural and inevitable. She showed him how to read tracks in ways that went beyond simple identification. Not just knowing that this print belonged to a deer and that one to a mountain lion, but understanding what the depth and spacing of tracks revealed about speed and purpose and state of mind. A running deer leaves tracks different from a browsing deer. A hunting lion moves different from a traveling lion. The land told stories to those who knew how to read them. She taught him about plants, which ones could be eaten and which would kill, which ones could heal and which ones could harm. She showed him how to find the water by following animal trails and watching for certain types of vegetation, how to predict weather by observing clouds and wind patterns and the behavior of birds and insects. And in return, James taught her things she needed to know about living in this particular country. How to read his cattle, how to know when a cow was preparing to calve or when a steer was going sick, how to maintain fences and repair leather tack. The practical mechanics of ranching that his culture had developed over generations of trial and error. But more than practical knowledge, they began sharing stories. One evening, perhaps a week after Sheriff Ridge's visit, they sat on the porch after Dakota had gone to sleep. The night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. James found himself talking about Margaret, really talking about her for the first time since her death. Met her at a church social in the spring of 1870, he said, his voice quiet in the darkness. I was 29 years old, thought I knew everything about everything. She was 26 and actually did know most things about most things, but she was kind enough not to lord it over me. He smiled at the memory. She had this way of looking at you, like she could see straight through all the nonsense to what was really there underneath. Scared me half to death at first. Then I realized that what she saw when she looked at me was something better than what I saw when I looked at myself. So I married her before she could figure out she was wrong. Aida listened without interrupting, letting him find his own path through the story. We had 5 good years, built this ranch from nothing but sweat and stubbornness. She kept a garden that shouldn't have been possible in this soil, but she had a gift for making things grow. Flowers everywhere, vegetables enough to trade in town. She made this hard place beautiful. His voice grew rougher. Summer of 1875, fever came through the valley, killed 6 people in town, 3 more out on the ranches. Margaret got sick on a Tuesday. By Friday, she was burning up, barely conscious. I rode to town for the doctor, but he was already out at the Harrison place dealing with their sick. By the time he got here Sunday morning, Margaret was gone, and the baby with her. James realized his hands were clenched tight on his knees. He forced them to relax. Girl child never took a breath. We buried them together in one grave because I couldn't stand the thought of separating them. Margaret would have wanted to hold her daughter. Silence settled between them, heavy with shared understanding of loss. I blamed myself, James continued. Should have ridden faster. Should have found the doctor sooner. Should have done something, anything different. Would not have mattered, Aida said quietly. When fever comes like that, nothing stops it. Not speed, not doctors, not prayer, only time and luck, and sometimes not even those. I know that now. Didn't know it then. Spent 3 years thinking maybe if I'd just been faster, smarter, better somehow, they'd still be alive. Aida was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke, her words coming slowly as if she was pulling them up from a deep well. The morning Thomas died, we fought. He wanted to go stake his claim at Black Mesa. I told him it was foolish, that Dutch would make trouble. We argued. I said terrible things. Her voice cracked slightly. Last words I spoke to him were, "You will get us all killed with your foolishness." He left angry, and I was right. He got himself killed. I have to carry that forever. James turned to look at her in the starlight. That's not the same as being responsible. Is it not? If I had been kinder, maybe he would have listened. Maybe he would have waited, been more careful. Maybe he would still be alive. Or maybe Dutch would have found another time, another way. Evil men don't stop being evil because we ask nicely or argue better. James paused, choosing his words carefully. Margaret used to tell me that guilt was a useless weight to carry unless it taught us something worth knowing. She'd say, "Did you mean harm? Did you act with evil intent? If not, then let it go and do better next time." Wise woman, Aida said softly. She was that. They sat in the darkness, two people who'd loved and lost, finding unexpected comfort in shared confession. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of understanding, of recognition, of the beginning of something that went deeper than simple partnership. On the 12th day since the rescue in the creek bed, James woke in the night to his own screaming. The nightmare had grabbed him with claws he couldn't fight, dragging him back to that terrible summer 3 years gone. He was riding toward town, pushing his horse too fast, hearing Margaret's voice calling for him from miles away. But the horse kept stumbling, the road kept getting longer, and no matter how hard he rode, he never got any closer to help. Then the dream shifted with the logic of nightmares, and suddenly he was standing beside Margaret's bed, watching her die while he held medicine he couldn't give her because his hands wouldn't work, his mouth wouldn't form words. His whole body was frozen in useless paralysis while she burned with fever and begged him to help. He jerked awake, gasping, and found himself holding the knife he kept under his pillow, blade extended toward a shadow standing next to his bed. The shadow was Aida. She didn't flinch from the knife, didn't step back or cry out, just stood there calm as stone, waiting for him to recognize her, to come back from whatever darkness had claimed him. James lowered the knife, hands shaking. "Jesus, I could have killed you." "But you did not," Aida said simply. "You woke before striking. That is what matters." James sat up, running one trembling hand through his sweat-soaked hair. The shame of it washed over him in waves. 41 years old, crying out in the night like a frightened child. Some protector he was. "You think you are only one with demons that come in darkness?" Aida said, reading his thoughts with uncanny accuracy. "I have them too, every night. Sometimes I dream of finding Thomas. Other times I dream we are still running and they catch us, hurt Dakota while I watch and cannot move. Dreams are where we cannot lie to ourselves. They show us what we fear most." She sat down on the edge of his bed, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel her presence like warmth from a fire. "You dream of your wife," she said. Not a question. "I dream I could have saved her if I'd just been faster, smarter, better. I dream I'm always too late." James's voice came out raw. "And I dream about the baby. Girl I never got to hold. Sometimes I wonder what she would have looked like, what she would have become. Then I feel guilty for wondering because it makes her death feel more real somehow." Aida nodded. "I dream of Dakota speaking again. Full sentences, laughter, all the sounds he made before he saw his father murdered. Then I wake and hear his silence and know my dream was lie. That silence is what Dutch took from us, not just Thomas, my son's voice." James looked at her in the darkness. "How do you stand it? How do you keep going? Because stopping would mean they won. Dutch, the men who killed Thomas, all the evil in this world. If I stop, if I give up, then they have killed not just my husband, but also me and my son. So I keep moving, keep fighting, keep building life from the broken pieces. That is how I stand it. She stood up, preparing to return to her bedroll, but James caught her hand before she could leave. Come with me, he said. There's something I need to do, something I should have done 3 years ago. He led her outside into the cool night air, across the yard to the small plot beyond the barn, where Margaret's grave lay marked by a simple wooden cross James had carved himself. He'd never been back here, not since the burial. Couldn't face it. Couldn't face the accusation he imagined in the empty ground. But tonight, with Aida beside him and 2 weeks left before Dutch came, tonight felt like the right time to finally say goodbye properly. Margaret, James said, his voice rough with disuse and emotion. I brought someone I want you to meet. This is Aida. She's been teaching me things, important things, about medicine and tracking and not carrying guilt that isn't mine to carry. Aida knelt beside the grave and began gathering sage that grew wild nearby. She struck flint to steel, caught the spark in dried grass, and lit the sage. The smoke rose sweet and sharp into the night air. She spoke in Apache, words James couldn't understand but could feel the weight of. Then she translated, her English carrying the cadence of prayer. I ask the spirits to release this man from chains of guilt. I ask the woman who sleeps here to forgive him for being human, for not having powers he never possessed. I ask her to send him peace so he can live again, love again, fight again. I ask her blessing on what we are building here in her home. The smoke drifted on the night breeze, carrying prayers up to whatever listened in the darkness above. James stood with his hand on Aida's shoulder and felt something break loose in his chest, some knot that had been pulled tight for 3 years suddenly releasing. He didn't sob, didn't collapse, just stood there as silent tears ran down his weathered face, washing away layers of grief and guilt and self-imposed punishment. He cried for Margaret and the daughter he'd never known, cried for 3 years lost to loneliness, cried for Thomas Whitefeather and the life Dutch had stolen, cried for Dakota's silence and Aida's strength and the sheer unfairness of a world that took good people and let evil ones prosper. When the tears finally stopped, he felt lighter somehow. He looked down at Aida, still kneeling by Margaret's grave, and saw tears on her own face. Tears for Thomas, for the life she'd lost, for all the ways grief had reshaped them both. Without thinking, James reached down and took her hand. She didn't pull away. They stood there together, two broken people holding each other up beside a grave that no longer felt like a prison. Margaret would have liked you, James said quietly. Would have said you're too stubborn for your own good, but she'd have meant it as a compliment. Aida's lips curved into the smallest smile. Thomas would have liked you too, would have said you are too proud but brave when it matters. Not healed. Healing took time, but beginning, at least, to imagine what healing might look like. Thank you, he whispered. Aida stood, letting the last of the sage burn down to ash. She was your past, that is good. Past should be honored. But Dakota and I, we are your present. Maybe your future too, if we survive what comes. You cannot protect future if you are chained to past. They walked back to the cabin together through darkness that felt less oppressive now, less suffocating. Inside, Dakota still slept, curled around his leather pouch of his father's medicines and memories. James lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind was too full, processing too much. But it was a good kind of full, the fullness of actually feeling things instead of the empty numbness that had been his companion for 3 years. The next morning, the tunnel was finished. 53 feet of hard-won passage from the root cellar to a concealed exit among the cottonwood roots by the creek bed. They shored it up properly, made sure it would hold, practiced crawling through it until even Dakota could navigate it in complete darkness. They had an escape route now, one piece of preparation complete, but there were still so many other pieces left to put in place, and time was running out faster than water through cupped hands. On the 13th day, Dutch came. He didn't come with guns blazing or threats shouted from a distance. He came like a man paying a social call, riding up the ranch road in the middle of the afternoon with only 2 men accompanying him. One was Jonah, the same man who'd been part of the group that chased Aita and Dakota into the creek bed. The other was someone James didn't recognize, a lean man with cold eyes who carried himself like professional violence. James met them in the yard with his rifle in hand, but not pointed. Aida stood on the porch with Dakota behind her, both of them watching with the stillness of prey that knows the predator has arrived. Dutch was in his mid-40s, weathered by years of hard work that had eventually paid off in wealth and power. He wore expensive clothes that didn't quite fit right, as if he'd bought the appearance of refinement but couldn't make it sit naturally on frame built for rougher purposes. His eyes, when they landed on James, held the flat certainty of a man who was used to getting what he wanted through money or intimidation or violence. "Thornton," Dutch said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake trying to convince a mouse that it meant no harm. "Heard you had guests, thought I'd ride out, see for myself. Maybe clear up some misunderstandings." "Nothing misunderstood about murder," James replied flatly, "or about chasing a woman and child through the desert." Dutch's smile didn't waver. "Now see, that's exactly the kind of misunderstanding I'm talking about. That woman there murdered her husband, got witnesses say they fought, that she wanted his silver claim for herself, got legal documents proving Thomas Whitefeather sold me those mining rights before his unfortunate accident." "Unfortunate accident," Aida said from the porch, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You shot him. You and your men, while my son watched it hidden in rocks. That is no accident. That is murder." Dutch finally looked at her, and something ugly moved behind his eyes. "Your husband killed my boy. His so-called medicine, his Apache superstitions. My Jacob was sick, and that Indian filled him with useless herbs instead of getting him real help. White medicine, Christian medicine, medicine that might have actually saved him. Your son had pneumonia in both lungs," Aida shot back. "No medicine saves that. Not white medicine, not a Apache medicine, not prayer or magic or anything else. Disease was too strong. Thomas tried everything. Your son was dying when he arrived at your house. Saving him was not possible." Dutch's face went hard and cold. "Don't you dare speak about my boy. Don't you dare tell me what was or wasn't possible. I watched him die. I held him while he burned up with fever. And your husband just stood there chanting his savage prayers like that would help, like that would do anything except steal time from real treatment. He was performing death blessing," Aida said, and her voice carried both patience and fury. "Helping your son's spirit journey to next world. He was showing respect, giving comfort, and you heard Apache words you did not understand and called it mockery." For a moment, James saw something flicker across Dutch's face. Doubt, maybe, or the beginning of terrible understanding. But then pride and grief and 3 years of nursing hatred slammed back down like a door closing. "You'll get your chance to explain all that to a judge," Dutch said. "I got legal papers being drawn up right now. Warrant for your arrest. Property deed for that silver claim. All official and proper. In 2 weeks, maybe less, the law comes for you and this rancher can't protect you from the law." He turned his attention back to James. "I'm here to make you an offer, Thornton. A fair one. You give me the woman and that boy. They go to town, face proper justice. In exchange, I don't bring charges against you for harboring a fugitive. You keep your ranch, your reputation, your life. Simple business transaction." "No," James said. The word came out flat and final. Dutch's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. I'm trying to do this civilized, but I can do it other ways if I have to. I got resources you can't imagine. Men, money, legal authority. You're one stubborn rancher standing between me and what's mine." "She's not yours," James said quietly. "Neither is the boy. They're under my protection, on my land. You want them? You're going to have to go through me, and that's going to cost you more than you're willing to pay." Dutch studied James for a long moment, recalculating. Then his gaze shifted past James to the porch where Dakota stood partially visible behind his mother. "That boy," Dutch said, and his voice went strange. "He looks like his father." "Yes," Aida said. "He has Thomas's eyes, his way of standing. Every day he reminds me of the man you murdered." Something broke in Dutch's expression. "You think I don't know what I did? You think I don't see Jacob's face every time I close my eyes? Your husband took my son from me. Whether he meant to or not, whether he tried his best or not, Jacob died while Thomas Whitefeather was supposed to be healing him. That's a debt that needed paying. So you killed him, James said, and now you're trying to kill his family. How does that balance anything? How does that bring your son back? Dutch's jaw clenched tight. It doesn't. Nothing brings him back. But maybe seeing that Indian's family suffer the way mine suffered will finally let me sleep at night. The truth of it hung in the air like smoke. This wasn't about silver or money or land rights. It was about grief twisted into hatred, loss transformed into cruelty, a father's love turned inside out until it became indistinguishable from evil. 3 days, Dutch said finally. I'm giving you 3 days to reconsider. After that, I come back with Sheriff Ridge and legal papers and enough men to make sure this goes how it needs to go. You can hand her over peaceful, or we can burn you out and take her from the ashes. Your choice. He wheeled his horse around and rode away, Jonah and the cold-eyed man following. James stood watching it until they disappeared over the rise, then turned to find Aida staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You should have let him take me, she said quietly. This is not your fight. It became my fight the moment I fired that shot in the creek bed. And I don't quit fights halfway through. Dakota stepped forward, his young face set with determination beyond his years. He walked straight to James and took his hand. Then he took his mother's hand with his other, connecting them. And in a voice that was growing stronger every day, he said the words that sealed their fate. We are family now. Family stays together. James looked down at the body, then up at Aida, and saw in her eyes that she knew the truth just as clearly as he did. They had 3 days to prepare for war. 3 days to get ready for Dutch to come back with numbers and weapons and the law on his side. 3 days to turn Ironwood Ranch into a fortress or a tomb. Then we better get to work, James said. We've got a lot to do and not much time to do it. That night, they sat at the table with paper and pencil, planning their defense like generals before battle. James drew a rough map of the ranch, marking every structure, every tree line, every place where an attacker could find cover or a defender could make a stand. Aida added notes in her precise hand, suggesting Apache tactics that James had never considered. Deadfall traps hidden in approach routes, warning systems made from tinkins and wire that would alert them to movement, backup caches of water and ammunition hidden away from the main cabin in case they got cut off. And all the while, Dakota watched and listened, learning the hard mathematics of survival, understanding that in 3 days their home might become a battlefield and everything they'd built together might go up in flames. But at least they'd be together when it happened. At least they wouldn't face it alone. And sometimes in hard country during harder times, that was enough. Outside, the night pressed close around Ironwood Ranch. Stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles. Coyotes sang their endless songs of hunger and survival. And somewhere in the darkness, Vincent Dutch nursed his hatred and planned his revenge, counting down the hours until he could finally finish what he'd started 3 years ago when he murdered Thomas Whitefeather and set in motion a chain of events that would end in blood and fire. 3 days. The countdown had begun. The 3 days passed like sand through an hourglass, impossible to slow, impossible to reclaim. James and Aida worked from dawn until long after dark, transforming Ironwood Ranch from a simple homestead into something that might withstand what was coming. They boarded up one window completely, leaving 2 others with narrow firing ports. James moved ammunition inside with the grim precision of a man who knew that running out of bullets meant running out of time. 200 rounds for the Winchester, 150 for the Colt revolvers, 50 shotgun shells. It seemed substantial until you imagined it spread across hours of fighting. Water filled every barrel and bucket they owned. The roof was shake shingle, dry as tinder after months without rain. One torch could turn their fortress into a furnace. Aida set traps in the approaches, deadfalls hidden under brush, sharpened stakes angled to catch running legs. She worked with focused intensity, understanding that warfare wasn't about honor, but about making the enemy pay for every inch of ground. Dakota helped with everything. The boy carried water, hauled ammunition, practiced crawling through the escape tunnel until he could navigate it in darkness. He was 10 years old and preparing for war. On the morning of the 3rd day, James woke up before dawn. The air felt different, pressure building like a storm about to break. Dark clouds stacked to the west, and the wind carried the smell of rain and change. Aida joined him on the porch. She studied the gathering storm and nodded. Storm comes. Good for us, bad for them. Rain makes powder wet, makes seeing hard, but also makes escape harder if we need tunnel. Question is whether Dutch waits for the storm to pass or uses it for cover. He will use it, Aida said with certainty. Men like him think weather is weapon for them. Pride makes them stupid. They spent the morning doing final checks. James found himself memorizing details. The way morning light hit the barn, the sound of chickens in their coop, the smell of coffee brewing. All the ordinary pieces of a life he might lose before sunset. Around midday, Dakota suddenly went rigid. He pointed toward the southern ridge without speaking. Riders. James grabbed his Winchester and moved to the window. Through the growing haze, he counted them. 10 men, maybe 12. They came slowly, not hiding their approach. Dutch rode at the front, and beside him was Sheriff Samuel Ridge. He brought the law, James said quietly. Makes us criminals if we resist. We are not criminals, Ayita said, her voice hard. We are survivors. The riders stopped 100 yards out, just beyond comfortable rifle range. Sheriff Ridge dismounted and walked forward alone, hands visible and empty. James stepped onto the porch. Sam, didn't expect to see you riding with Dutch. Ridge looked pained. Got no choice, James. Circuit judge came through 3 days ago, earlier than expected. Dutch must have greased some palms, issued a new warrant, proper legal this time, that I can't ignore like the last one. Says I have to bring in Ayita Whitefeather for questioning in the death of Thomas Whitefeather. It's legal now, official. It's also a lie. Dutch murdered Thomas. Maybe so, but that's for a judge to sort out, not me. Ridge held up a folded document. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Aida stepped out beside James. I will go with you, Sheriff. I will face your justice. But my son stays here with James. That is my condition. No, James said immediately. Yes, Aida insisted. Better I hang than Dakota watches another death. Dutch had been sitting his horse, watching with satisfaction. Now he urged his mount forward. How noble. The savage woman offering herself up. Almost makes you forget she's a murderer. Your son died of pneumonia that was already killing him when Thomas arrived, Ayita said, her voice cutting through the rain. No medicine, white or Apache, could have saved him. You know this. Your own doctor told you this. Something flickered across Dutch's face. Not quite doubt, but something adjacent to it. You weren't there, Dutch said, but his voice had lost some edge. You didn't watch him burn up while your husband chanted words that meant nothing. I was there. I helped Thomas. I saw your son. Sickness was already too deep. White doctor said same thing. Nothing to be done. But you needed someone to blame because grief without blame is unbearable. So you blamed Thomas. Then you killed him, and now you want to kill us to make grief stop hurting. But it will not stop. Murder never heals grief. It only spreads it. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to break bones. Even the approaching storm seemed to pause. Then Dakota did something no one expected. He walked out of the cabin, moving past James and his mother, walking straight toward the line of armed with fearless certainty. Dakota? No, Aida started, but the boy kept walking. He stopped 20 feet from Sheriff Ridge and Dutch. From his shirt, he pulled the leather pouch he'd been clutching since James first saw him. With careful movements, Dakota opened it and turned it upside down. Dried herbs fell out, small stones, a few feathers, but no map, no deed, no evidence of silver claims. This is all we have, Dakota said, his voice carrying clear and strong. My father hid nothing. He wanted to file legal claim. Dutch murdered him before he could. I watched from the rocks. I saw Jonah hold my father while Dutch shot him. I saw them arrange the rock fall to make it look like accident. I saw everything. His young face held more pain and strength than any child should carry. You killed my father for silver that we burned. You chased us for months for treasure that does not exist. You are killing yourself with hate. But we will not die. We choose to live. We choose to build instead of destroy. We choose family over revenge. Dutch stared at the boy like seeing a ghost. You look like him. You look exactly like Thomas. Good, Dakota said. I want to look like my father. He was brave man. Good man. Better man than you will ever be. For a moment, James thought Dutch might break down. The man's face twisted with emotions too complicated to name. Then pride won. His expression hardened back into certainty and righteousness. Pretty speech, boy, but speeches don't change facts. Sheriff, arrest that woman, now. Before Ridge could move, Dutch drew his revolver, a Remington with fancy engraving that had probably cost more than most men earned in a year. If the law won't handle this, I will. The woman comes with me, or people start dying. He aimed the gun at Dakota. James moved without thinking, pure instinct overriding caution. He brought his Winchester up and fired in one smooth motion. The bullet took Dutch's gun hand. The Remington went spinning through the air. Dutch screamed and grabbed his shattered hand, blood pouring between his fingers. No, Sheriff Ridge shouted, but events had already slipped past the point where shouting mattered. Jonah drew his weapon and fired at Dakota. The shot went wide by inches. Before Jonah could fire again, Aida threw her knife. 40 feet through the air, the blade buried itself in Jonah's shoulder. He dropped his gun and fell backward off his horse. Then everyone was shooting. The storm that had been threatening all day chose that moment to break. Thunder cracked directly overhead like the sky splitting open. Rain came down in sheets, turning dust to mud in seconds and reducing visibility to arm's length. Run, James shouted at Dakota. The boy sprinted for the cabin while bullets kicked up mud around his feet. James laid down covering fire, working the Winchester's lever as fast as his hands could move. Aida had already made it to the porch and was firing her own rifle with precision. Dutch's men scattered, seeking cover. Lightning strobed the battlefield in violent flashes, each one revealing chaos before darkness swallowed it again. Inside! James called, backing toward the cabin. Now! They retreated through the door, and James slammed it shut, dropping the heavy bar into place. Outside, rain hammered down like judgment. Thunder rolled in waves that shook the walls. Everyone okay? James asked. Aida had a graze on her arm, barely worth noticing. Dakota seemed unharmed. James himself had taken no hits. We are alive, Aida said. For now, but they have us trapped. Then we make them pay for the privilege, James replied grimly. The siege settled into an ugly rhythm. Dutch's men would try to advance. James and Aida would drive them back with a rifle fire. The storm raged overhead, turning the ranch yard into churned mud. Hours passed. James lost track of time, measuring it by ammunition expended, and near misses survived. His shoulder began to throb with deep pain. Old injury protesting new stress. Around mid-afternoon, Dutch's men tried something new. They lit torches, wrapped in oil-soaked cloth that burned despite the rain, and threw them at the cabin. Most fell short or were extinguished by the downpour, but one landed on the roof. James heard it hit, heard the sizzle as fire fought rain. Attic, he said to Aida, I'll go. No, I go. I am lighter, faster. You keep shooting. She was gone before he could argue, scrambling up the ladder. James heard her moving around up there, heard water splashing as she threw buckets at flames trying to take hold. More torches came. James shot 2 out of the air, but couldn't stop them all. Buck started seeping down from above, growing thicker. James could hear Aida coughing, could smell wood beginning to char. It's no good, she called down. Fire is spreading. We need to leave, now. James looked at Dakota. The boy was in the root cellar entrance, holding spare ammunition, his face pale but composed. Root cellar, both of you, through the tunnel. I'll cover your retreat. No, Aida said, climbing back down. Her face was smudged with soot, eyes watering from smoke. We go together or not at all. That was agreement. Outside, Dutch's men sensed weakness. They began advancing through the rain, emboldened by smoke pouring from the roof. James fired twice more, but the Winchester was running low. Maybe 20 rounds left. Barn, James said. We fall back to the barn. Stone foundation, harder to burn. We can hold there longer. 50 yards in the open, Aida observed. They will shoot us before halfway. Not if we move during lightning strike. When the flash comes, we run. Their eyes will be blind from brightness. We'll have maybe 3 seconds. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only plan they had. James grabbed Dakota, pulled him close. When I say run, you run faster than you ever have. Don't look back. Don't slow down. Just get to that barn door. Understand? Dakota nodded, no fear in his face. Just trust. They crouched by the door waiting. Thunder rolled. Lightning flickered, but not bright enough. They needed a direct strike. The cabin groaned as fire worked deeper into the roof. Smoke filled the main room. They were out of time. Then the lightning came. Not just a flash, but a sustained blaze of white light that turned the world into a photographic negative. Thunder hit simultaneously, so loud it felt like physical impact. Now, James shouted, throwing the door open. They ran, three figures sprinting through blinding rain and mud, racing toward the barn. James had Dakota's hand, pulling the boy along. Aida ran beside them. Gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets whined past. James didn't look back, just kept his legs pumping and his grip tight on Dakota's hand. 30 yards. 20. The barn loomed ahead. 10 yards. They were going to make it. Then Dakota cried out and stumbled. James caught him before he fell, but he saw the blood on the boy's arm. Not much, just a graze, but blood nonetheless. Dakota's blood. The sight of it triggered something primal in James. He scooped Dakota up in his arms, not caring about his burning shoulder, not caring about the bullets still searching for them. He ran the last yards and crashed through the barn door with Aida right behind him. Inside, blessed shelter from the rain. James set Dakota down gently, his hands shaking as he examined the wound. Just a graze. The bullet had carved a shallow furrow across the boy's upper arm. Painful but not dangerous. But still, blood, a child's blood, because of him. I'm okay, Dakota said. His voice was steady despite pain showing on his face. It's just a scratch. You said yourself that men always say just a scratch when it's not, but this really is just a scratch. Despite everything, James felt a smile pull at his mouth. Smart boy. Smart for your own good sometimes. Aida was already tearing fabric from her shirt, making a bandage. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound with whiskey, applying herbs, binding it tight. While she worked, James surveyed their new position. The barn was larger than the cabin, with a stone foundation that would resist fire better. But it also had more openings, more places Dutch's men could fire through. And they'd left most of their ammunition in the burning cabin. He checked his pockets. 30 rounds for the Winchester, 2 boxes of pistol ammunition. Not much, not nearly enough. Through cracks in the barn walls, James could see men moving in the storm, regrouping, preparing for another assault. We're not going to win this by fighting, James said quietly. We're outnumbered, nearly out of ammunition. If we keep trading shots, we'll eventually lose. Then what do we do? Aida asked. We cannot run. Tunnel is back in cabin, blocked by fire. We cannot surrender. Dutch will kill us even if we give up. Maybe not, James said slowly. Maybe if I can get Dutch alone, get him talking, I can reach whatever part of him used to be human. He's a father who lost his son. I'm a father who lost a daughter. Maybe that's common ground enough. Or maybe he just shoots you, Aida pointed out. Then I guess we find out which kind of man he really is. Before anyone could argue, James stood and walked to the barn door. He opened it just enough to shout into the storm, Dutch, I want to talk. Just you and me, man to man. The response came after a long pause. Why would I talk to a dead man? Because you're not a murderer by nature. Because you're a father who made terrible choices out of grief. Because maybe there's a way out of this that doesn't end with more bodies in the ground. Another pause. Then surprisingly, 5 minutes, no weapons. You and me in the middle of the yard. James handed his rifle to Aida. Their eyes met, and in that moment 1,000 things passed between them. Trust, respect, something deeper that neither had names for yet. If this goes wrong, James started. It will not go wrong, Aida interrupted, because you are James Thornton, and you do not give up. Go talk to this broken man. Make him remember he was human once. James stepped out into the rain. Dutch walked forward from the other side, and James saw immediately that the man hadn't left his weapon behind. The Remington was gone, but he had another pistol tucked in his belt. James kept walking anyway, empty hands visible. They met in the middle of the churned mud, rain soaking them both within seconds. Up close, Dutch looked older than James had realized. Older and tired and eaten hollow by 3 years of hatred. You wanted to talk, Dutch said. So talk. Your hand needs proper tending or you'll lose it to infection. I've lost worse things than a hand. I know, I lost a wife and child. I know exactly what that kind of loss feels like. You don't know anything, Dutch spat. Your wife died of disease, natural causes. My boy died because of incompetence. Because Thomas Whitefeather filled him with useless Indian medicine instead of getting him real help. Your boy died because pneumonia doesn't care about skin color or what kind of medicine you use. Thomas did everything he could. So did your white doctor. Sometimes everything isn't enough. Dutch's face twisted. You weren't there. You didn't watch your son burn up while some Apache chanted prayers that sounded like mockery. Apache death prayers honor the dying, James said. The smiling, the chanting, they guide the spirit to peace. Thomas gave your son the greatest gift he knew how to give. And you heard compassion in a language you didn't understand and called it evil. For a moment, something cracked in Dutch's expression. Doubt. Terrible dawning understanding. He was smiling, Dutch whispered. When Jacob died, Thomas was smiling. What kind of man smiles at a child's death? Apache death blessing includes smiling, James said. It shows the spirit there's joy waiting in the next world. It's meant as comfort, as hope, not as disrespect. The rain poured down between them. Thunder rolled, and Dutch stood there with his ruined hand and his 3 years of misdirected rage, finally hearing the truth. I killed him for nothing, Dutch said. The words came out broken. I murdered a good man because I didn't understand his prayers, because I needed someone to blame and he was convenient, because being angry was easier than being sad. Yes, James said, you did all that, and you can't take it back, but you can stop making it worse. You can let Aita and Dakota live. You can face justice for what you did instead of compounding murder with more murder. You can choose to be the man your son thought you were instead of the monster grief turned you into. Dutch looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and understood too late. My son thought I was good, thought I was brave and strong and fair. He would hate what I've become, then become something different. Right now, this moment, that's all any of us can do. For a heartbeat, James thought it might actually work, thought Dutch might choose redemption over revenge. But then the man's face hardened again, pride and shame combining into something toxic and final. I've come too far to stop now, Dutch said, his hand moving toward the pistol in his belt. This has to end the way it has to end. James saw the movement, knew what was coming, knew he'd gambled and lost. But the shot that rang out didn't come from Dutch's gun. Sheriff Ridge fired from the edge of the yard, his bullet taking Dutch in the shoulder and spinning him around. The man fell into the mud, his weapon dropping unfired. Ridge walked forward, his face grim. That's enough, Dutch. It's over. He gestured to his deputies who'd been hanging back. Take them all. Dutch, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Whitefeather. The rest of you, accessory to murder, attempted murder, assault. You'll all have your day in court. He looked down at Dutch in the mud. We got witnesses now. Got the boy's testimony. And I just watched you try to murder another man during a parley. You're done, Bamawaisaram. We got witnesses now. Got the boy's testimony. And I just watched you try to murder another man during a parley. You're done, Yahamti. And I just watched you try to murder another man during a parley. You're done, Joe. Dutch lay in the mud, bleeding from 2 gunshot wounds now, and started to laugh. The sound was hollow and broken. My son, he whispered. Jacob, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. The storm began to break then, the rain easing from downpour to steady fall. Light started seeping through the clouds. James walked back to the barn where Aita and Dakota waited. The boy ran to him and James caught him up, holding him tight despite the pain in his shoulder. Papa, Dakota said, you came back. James felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking, opening like ice melting after a long winter. Always, he promised, I'll always come back to you, both of you. Aida stood in the barn doorway, and when James met her eyes, he saw everything he needed to see. They'd survived, against odds that should have broken them, they'd survive together. Segment 6. Rebuilding and Legacy. 6 weeks later, Eagle Ridge Valley had transformed. Not the land itself, but Ironwood Ranch had become something different, something better. The new cabin rose larger than the old one, built with help from townspeople who appeared without being asked. Pastor Elijah Crane organized work parties. Claire Monroe brought food. 30 people from Redstone Town gave their labor and materials, making amends for 3 years of looking away from Dutch's corruption. James stood watching the raising of the main beam, a massive piece of ponderosa pine that would form the ridgeline. The beam was carved with symbols, Apache designs that Aida had drawn, and James had spent weeks cutting into the wood. Blending their worlds, Dakota worked alongside the men, no longer the silent, frightened child who'd watched his father die. He talked now, full sentence and questions and even jokes. The sound of his laughter was the most beautiful thing James had ever heard. The new cabin reflected compromise and creativity. 30 feet by 24, larger than before. 3 rooms instead of 2. One for James, one for Aida, one for Dakota. But the main room had 2 special features. The eastern wall held a large window positioned so Aida could face the rising sun for her morning prayers. And the western wall held a small alcove where Margaret's photograph hung beside Thomas Whitefeather's. 2 ghosts honored and remembered, but no longer holding the living hostage to grief. When the cabin was finished, the whole town came for a celebration that wasn't quite a wedding, but meant just as much. Pastor Crane stood on the new porch and addressed the gathered crowd. "We're here to witness a covenant," Crane said. "Not a marriage in the traditional sense, because sometimes tradition needs to bend to accommodate truth. What we have here is a partnership, a commitment, a family built not from blood alone, but from choice and courage and shared survival." James stood beside Aida, both dressed in clothes that split the difference between Apache and frontier styles. Aida wore a buckskin dress decorated with beadwork, traditional patterns mixed with new designs. James wore his best shirt and pants, but around his neck hung a necklace Aida had made, silver and turquoise in Apache style. Between them stood Dakota, one hand in each of theirs, connecting them. "James Thornton," Crane continued, "do you promise to stand beside this woman as equal partner, to honor her strength and wisdom, to raise her son as your own, to build a future together while honoring the past that shaped you both?" "I do," James said. His voice was steady, certain. "I promise all of that and more. I promise to learn from her, to protect her and Dakota with my life, and to make Ironwood Ranch a home worthy of the family we've become." Crane turned to Aida. "And you, Aida Whitefeather Thornton, do you make the same promises? To stand beside this man, to share in his life and work, to build something new without forgetting what came before?" "I do," Aida said in clear English. "I promise to walk this path together, to share burden and joy, to teach my ways while learning his, to make family from the broken pieces we were given." They exchanged practical gifts instead of rings. James gave Aida a new skinning knife, fine as steel he could afford with a handle he'd carved from elk antler. Aida gave James a medicine pouch assembled from herbs she'd gathered, a gift of healing for a man wounded in more ways than one. Dakota gave them both something he'd worked on in secret, a length of braided rope, 3 strands woven together so tightly they became one. Red for James, black for Aida, white for himself. "3 strands are not easily broken," Dakota said. "We are family now. Whatever comes, we face it together." The celebration lasted into evening. Food and music, frontier fiddles mixing with Apache drums. People danced, children played, and for those hours, Ironwood Ranch became simply a home where people gathered to honor commitment and hope. As the sun set, James found himself standing with Sheriff Ridge. "Dutch goes to trial next month," Ridge said quietly. "He's confessing to everything. Jonah and the others are cooperating, giving testimony in exchange for lighter sentences. Turns out when a man's facing a noose, loyalty gets real flexible. Says he wants to face justice, make some kind of amends before he dies. Judge will probably give him life in prison." "How's he doing?" James asked. "Broken. Says he sees his son in his dreams, asking why his father became a monster. Wants to write a letter to Dakota, apologize for what he did." Ridge looked at James. You think the boy would want to read something like that? James considered. Dakota has a right to decide for himself. He's young, but he's been through things that aged him. If Dutch wants to write, let him write. Dakota can choose whether to read it or burn it. Ridge nodded slowly. You're a good man, James Thornton. Better than most. As the party wound down, James walked to the small cemetery plot where Margaret's grave lay. He'd placed flowers there that morning, same as always. But now Thomas Whitefeather had a proper grave beside hers with a headstone that read, Thomas Whitefeather, loving husband, good father, healer. James stood between the two graves. Margaret, I know I talk to you too much. Aida says you probably want me to move on, but I figure you'd want to know how things turned out. He knelt. I found a partner, not a replacement for you, could never be that, but someone who fits into the empty places you left behind. Think you two would have been friends. The wind carried laughter from the cabin where Ayita and Dakota cleaned up. And we got a boy now, 10 years old, and already braver than most men I've known. He calls me Papa. Margaret. Wish you could see him. Wish you could see what we're building here. James stood. I'm not abandoning your memory, just adding to it, making room for new chapters while honoring the old ones. Hope you understand. Frame, autumn 1915, Ironwood Ranch. And that, James said to his grandson, is how this family came to be. Not through blood alone, but through choice. Through standing together when the world tried to break us apart. Henry sat silent, processing everything. The sun had set during the telling and stars began appearing. What happened to Dutch? Henry finally asked. Did he hang? No, judge gave him life in prison. He served 12 years before tuberculosis took him. Toward the end, he wrote that letter to Dakota. Your father still has it. Read it once, said it made him sad more than angry. James pulled out a folded paper, yellowed with age. This was part of Dutch's letter, the only part I ever read. Henry unfolded it and read aloud. To the boy whose father I murdered, I have no right to ask forgiveness. I only want you to know your father was a good man who tried to save my son. I heard Apache words and thought them mockery. I killed a better man than I ever was because grief made me stupid and pride made me cruel. Carry his memory with honor. Henry folded it carefully. That must have been hard to read. Dakota's not my friend, James corrected gently. He's my son, has been since that day in the barn. And yeah, it was hard, but it was also necessary. Hate dies when you refuse to feed it. Dutch learned that too late. We learned it just in time. Hoofbeats announced a rider. Henry's face lit up. Dad's here. Dakota Thornton rode into the yard, 57 years old, wearing the badge of a Deputy United States Marshal. He dismounted and embraced James carefully, mindful of old bones. Father, Henry, hope I'm not interrupting. Never an interruption, James said. Was just telling your son about how we all came together. Dakota looked at Henry. And what does he think? I think, Henry said slowly, that I'm proud to carry the blood I carry. Apache and white, mixed together. 3 cultures in one family. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something worth fighting for. Dakota's face broke into a smile. Good answer. Your grandmother would have approved. He pulled flowers from his saddlebag. Thought we could visit her grave together. All 3 generations. They walked to the cemetery plot holding 3 graves. Margaret, Thomas. And between them, Aida, who'd passed 3 years ago at 66. Her headstone read simply, Aida Thornton, wife, mother, healer, the heart of Ironwood. They laid flowers on her grave and stood in silence. Then James spoke, his voice carrying 75 years of weight and wisdom. Henry, you asked me earlier about legacy. I'll tell you what I've learned. He gestured at the ranch around them. Legacy isn't what you leave behind in property or money. Legacy is what you leave behind in people. The lessons you teach, the love you give, the courage you model. Your grandmother taught me that. She taught me that family isn't just blood. It's who you choose to stand beside when the world gets hard. It's who you fight for, who you build with, who you refuse to abandon no matter what comes. He put one hand on Dakota's shoulder, the other on Henry's. 3 generations connected. I was a dead man when I met Aida and Dakota. dead in all the ways that mattered. They gave me back my life by needing me, by trusting me, by choosing to stand with me when running would have been safer. And in return, I gave them a home, a name, a place to belong. He looked at Henry directly. That's what this ranch really is. Not land and buildings. It's a testament to the idea that broken people can heal each other if they're brave enough to try. That family is made, not found. That love is a choice you make every single day, especially on the days when it's hard. Dakota added his own wisdom. Your great-grandfather Thomas was murdered for silver that never mattered. He died because one man couldn't see past his own grief to recognize healing when it was offered. Don't be that man, Henry. When life breaks you, and it will, don't let the breaking make you cruel. Let it make you kind. Let it make you strong in ways that matter. Henry looked at both of them, then at the graves. I promise, I'll remember. I'll carry it forward. They stood together as full darkness claimed the valley. Above them, stars wheeled in patterns that predated human concerns and would outlast human memory. But for now, in this moment, 3 generations of Thorntons stood together on land that meant something because of what had happened here. Not because of resources it contained or profit it generated, but because this was where a broken cowboy and a running woman and a silent boy had chosen each other, where they'd fought together, built together, healed together, where they'd proved that family wasn't about perfection, it was about showing up. It was about standing firm when the world tried to scatter you. It was about making a home out of whatever pieces life left you with and refusing to let those pieces stay broken. Come on, James said finally. Your grandmother always said the dead don't need us standing over them. They need us living. So let's go inside. Let's eat together, tell stories, make plans. Let's keep doing what she taught Owen to do. They walked back toward the house, 3 silhouettes against light spilling from the windows. Inside, warmth and food and the continuation of a family that had survived everything the world could throw it at. Behind them, the graves stood silent and patient, the dead keeping watch over the living, the past holding space for the future. Ironwood Ranch endured, the family endured, and that, in the end, was legacy enough for anyone. Ironwood Ranch remains in operation today, still owned by Thornton family descendants. The original main beam, carved with Apache symbols, stands in the ranch house. Vincent Dutch died in territorial prison in 1890. Sheriff Samuel Ridge served until 1895. Dakota Thornton became a U.S. Deputy Marshal in 1895, serving with distinction for 30 years. James Thornton lived to age 82, passing in 1922. The Silver Vein at Black Mesa was designated sacred Apache land in 1924. Never mind. Never.